Here is my disclaimer. The following information was obtained from historical records, eyewitness accounts, other information sources, and including my own opinion. Since I was not always there at the time to verify it, it may or may not be correct. The Ford single overhead cam 427 V8 engine, known as the Cammer, was released in 1964 in an effort to counter the NASCAR large block 426 Chrysler Hemi engine. The engine was called the 90-day wonder because they supposedly designed and built it in 90 days. What they did was convert the race-proven 427 side-oiler engine to an overhead cam Hemi. The block and associated parts were largely unchanged, but an idler shaft replaced the camshaft in the block, which necessitated plugging the remaining camshaft bearing oiling holes. The heads were designed with hemispherical combustion chambers and a single overhead camshaft over each head, operating shaft-mounted roller rocker arms. The valve train consisted of valves larger than those on Ford wedgehead engines, made out of stainless steel and with sodium-filled exhaust valves to prevent the valve heads from burning, and dual valve springs. This design allowed for high volumetric efficiency at high engine speed. The idler shaft in the block in place of the camshaft was driven by the timing chain and drove the distributor and oil pump in conventional fashion. An additional sprocket on this shaft drove a second timing chain, 6 feet long, which drove both overhead camshafts. The length of this chain made precision timing of the camshafts supposedly an issue at high RPM, but as you will see later on, that issue is debatable. The engines were essentially hand-built for racing, with combustion chambers fully machined to reduce variability. With a single 4-barrel carburetor, they weighed 680 pounds and were rated at 616 horsepower at 7,000 RPM. With dual 4-barrel carburetors, they were rated at 657 horsepower at 7,500 RPM. Ford sold them at their parts counter. The dual carburetor model was listed at $3,395. Ford's hopes to counter Chrysler were cut short. Although enough 427 Cammers were sold to have the design approved, Chrysler protests succeeded in getting NASCAR to effectively legislate the engine out of competition. This was due to the engine not being available in a factory production motor vehicle. This stopped the awaited 1965 Cammer versus Hemi competition at the Daytona 500 season opener. The engine never turned a lap in NASCAR competition. With NASCAR no longer an option, the SOHC 427 found a place in non-stock drag racing, powering many altered wheelbase AFX Mustangs and becoming the basis for a handful of supercharged top-fuel dragsters and eventually funny cars. I read drag racers had to work through the issue of possible stretching of the 6-foot-long timing chain. Working with Harvey Crane of Crane Cams and PNS Machine, Pete Robinson produced this gear drive system. Note the additional gear on the left bank, allowing a right-hand camshaft to be used on both cylinder heads. Now, with that being said, Connie Coletta said this about the Cammer chain stretch, and I quote, "The chain didn't stretch. It's hard to stretch a chain like that. I never saw chain stretch." That was Ed Pink talking and making a mountain out of a molehill, and I kicked his tail all over the place. So it appears Connie Coletta never had problems with it. You can always count on Coletta to say it like it is. Now let's look at a few of the cars, famous and not so famous, that ran that NASCAR Ford Cammer engine. This is the Coleman Super Ford, owned by Larry Coleman and Bill Taylor from Memphis, Tennessee. The 1968 Ford Torino by Loggy Stamping was powered by a supercharged Nitro 427 Cammer Ford with an automatic transmission. In 1969 it ran 711 at 209 miles per hour. Here is the Night Stalker, owned by John and Louis Force from Fullerton, California. John and Louis Force purchased the 1972 Mustang from Jack Chrisman. Chrisman had built the car but never raced it. The Cammer engine was mounted sideways with a chain drive. The configuration never had much success. In 1972 it ran a 780 at 182 miles per hour at Irwindale. This is the Harvey Ford car, owned by Don Nicholson from Atlanta, Georgia. The 1966 Ford Mustang was powered by a carbureted gas 427 Ford SOHC by Earl Wade with a 4-speed manual transmission. In 1969 at Cecil County it ran a 986 at 139 miles per hour. Here is the 1970 Ford Mustang by Fletcher owned by Jack Chrisman from Long Beach, California. It was powered by a supercharged Nitro 427 Cammer engine with a 2-speed manual transmission. On March 28, 1970 at Orange County it ran a 848. Here is the 1973 Mustang owned by Larry Gould from Belleville, Illinois. It was powered by a supercharged Nitro 427 Ford with a 2-speed manual transmission. Gould was at the New York Nationals where he ran a 654 at 236 miles per hour. The speed was a new high for Ford-powered funny cars. This is the Going Thing owned by Tommy Grove from Hayward, California. The Ford Mustang by the Logie Stamping Company was powered by a supercharged Nitro 427 Cammer by Tommy Grove with an automatic transmission. Grove debuted the car in late 1968 and raced it through 1970. At Irwindale, California in 1968 it ran a 774. Here is the Chapman Performance Stampede owned by Dick Lure from Lansing, Michigan. 1969 Ford Mustang by Chapman Automotive. It was powered by a supercharged Nitro 427 Ford Cammer by John Skiba with an automatic transmission. In 1970 it ran a best of 720 at 205 miles per hour. This is Keaton's Cougar owned by D. Keaton from Long Beach, California. The 1968 Mercury Cougar by Fletcher was powered by a supercharged Nitro 427 Ford Cammer with an automatic transmission. On September 3, 1968 at Irwindale it ran a 793. Here is the Connie Coletta Bounty Hunter owned by Connie Coletta from Mount Clemens, Michigan. The 1969 Ford Mustang by Logie Stamping Company was powered by a supercharged Nitro 427 Cammer with a 3-speed manual transmission. I read this car was offered for sale in an April 1970 National Dragster. The ad stated that the car ran low sevens at over 200 miles per hour. It was offered at $10,000 complete with a Cammer engine. Also available at an extra cost was enough parts to run for a year. If this car was $10,000 in 1970, what do you think this car would bring at auction today? This 1958 Corvette called Paperboy is owned by Bill Lerner from Natick, Massachusetts. It was powered by an injected Nitro 427 Ford Cammer engine with a 3-speed manual transmission. Here is the Mickey Thompson's Mach 1 owned by Mickey Thompson from El Monte, California. The 1969 Ford Mustang by Pat Foster was powered by a supercharged Nitro 427 Ford SOHC by Amos Satterley with a 3-speed manual transmission. On March 8, 1970 at Lyons it ran a 725. This is the Russ Davis Ford owned by Gas Ronda from Azusa, California. The 1968 Ford Mustang by Exhibition Engineering was powered by a supercharged Nitro 427 Ford SOHC by Ed Pink with an automatic transmission. On November 16, 1968 at Irwindale it ran a 782 at 187 miles per hour. Here is the Airlift Rattler owned by Ed Shartman from Cleveland, Ohio. The 1969 Mercury Cougar by Logie Stamping Company was powered by a supercharged Nitro 427 Ford SOHC by Amos Satterley with a 2-speed manual transmission. At Atco, New Jersey on July 23, 1969 it ran a 746. This is Superstang owned by Paul Stefanski from Wayne, Michigan. His new Mustang for 1969 used a Logie-built 118-inch chassis. Shedlick built the fiberglass Mustang body and it weighed 115 pounds. The engine was a 427 SOHC built by Doug Nash that used a Moldex stroker crank that upped the displacement to 488. In 1969 it ran a 750. Here is the Revel Kit car owned by Skip Hess from Temple City, California. The 1968 Ford Mustang by Jim Kirby was powered by a supercharged gas 427 Ford SOHC with an automatic transmission. On June 28, 1969 at Orange County it ran an 862 in AA gas. This is the Malco gasser owned by George Montgomery from Dayton, Ohio. The 1967 Ford Mustang by George Montgomery was powered by a supercharged gas 427 Ford SOHC by Montgomery with an automatic transmission. This blown, stock displacement 427 Camry had 4-hole upright Hilborn injectors. The frame was built by Montgomery off of a heavily modified 1933 Willies frame rails to conform to NHRA's gas class stock automobile type frame rule. The car weighs 2,150 pounds. In 1967 it ran a 846. Here is Mr. Gasket Dyno Don owned by Don Nicholson from Orange, California. The 1970 Ford Maverick was powered by a carbureted gas 427 Ford SOHC by Earl Wade with a 4-speed manual transmission. In Crofton, Maryland on July 1, 1970 it ran a 974. I saw a video on YouTube profiling this car. It still runs and drives today. This is the Baney Ford Special owned by Lou Baney and driven by Don Prudhomme. The 1967 Dragster by Don Long was powered by a supercharged Nitro 427 Ford SOHC with direct drive. On October 21, 1967 at Lyons, Prudhomme ran a 684. Here is the Bounty Hunter owned by Connie Coletta from Mount Clemens, Michigan. The 1965 Dragster was powered by a supercharged Nitro 427 Ford SOHC with direct drive. It had a 144-inch loggy chassis. Coletta was the first to run the new SOHC Ford in a dragster. He won Bakersfield. He ran a 767 the number 6 qualifier at AHRA at Beeline in 1965. In 1967 Connie Coletta's Camry-powered Bounty Hunter Dragster won top fuel honors at AHRA, NHRA and NASCAR winter meets, becoming the only Triple Crown winner in drag racing history. This is the Bardall SOHC Ford owned by Clester Andrews from League City, Texas. The 1965 Ford Mustang by Holman Moody was powered by an injected Nitro 427 Camry with an automatic transmission. At the 1969 Winter Nationals in Pomona it ran a 967 at 158 miles per hour. Here is the Super Mustang owned by Tom McEwen from Long Beach, California. The 1967 Dragster by Logie Stamping Company was powered by a 427 Camry with an automatic transmission. On February 2, 1967 it ran an 831 at Pomona. This is Tinker Toy 7 owned by Pete Robinson from Atlanta, Georgia. The 1968 Dragster by Woody Gilmore, RCE was powered by a supercharged Nitro 427 Ford SOHC by Pete Robinson with direct drive. On September 6, 1970 in Indianapolis it ran a 664. Here is Jack Chrisman's Kendall GT1 owned by Jack Chrisman from Long Beach, California. The 1966 Mercury Comet by Logie Stamping Company, Jack Chrisman got one of 4 original Logie-built Comets. It was powered by a supercharged Nitro 427 Ford SOHC with an automatic transmission. In 1966 it ran an 834. This is the Tasca Ford car owned by Bill Lawton from Providence, Rhode Island. In the 60s, Bill Lawton was Rhode Island's most successful funny car driver. The 1967 Ford Mustang by Logie Stamping Company was powered by a supercharged Nitro 427 Ford Camry with an automatic transmission. Here is Gate Job owned by Pete Gates from Wayne, Michigan. In 1967, Pete got a new car that consisted of a leftover 1966 Comet fiberglass body on a brand new Logie chassis. It was powered by an injected Nitro 427 Ford SOHC by Earl Wade with an automatic transmission. On May 7, 1967 at Milan it ran a 854 at 170 miles per hour. This is the Daddy Warbucks owned by Phil Bonner from Decatur, Georgia. The 1964 Ford Falcon by Holman Moody was powered by an injected nitro 427 Ford SOHC by Holman Moody with direct drive. In 1966 in Dickinson, Texas, it ran a 894 at 155 miles per hour. This is the Starlight 4 owned by Chuck Griffith from Pomona, California. The 1969 Dragster was powered by a supercharged Nitro 427 Ford SOHC with direct drive. At Irwindale on June 7, 1969, it ran a 713 at 220 miles per hour. Here is the ring-free Trojan horse owned by Gene Solari and Larry Fullerton from Long Beach, California. The 1967 Ford Mustang was powered by a supercharged Nitro 427 Ford SOHC with a 3-speed manual transmission. I read Fullerton ran SOHC Fords in his cars until his later Maverick switched to an early Hemi in mid-1970. Larry ran a 846 at Irwindale. This 1965 Comet was owned by Hayden Proffitt from Westminster, California. It was powered by an injected Nitro 427 Ford SOHC with a 4-speed manual transmission. Proffitt was at Houston, Texas early in 1966 for a best-of-3 match race against Del Hainault, who was driving Pete Seaton's Corvair. Hayden reset the track record with a 9.54 warm-up run at 154 miles per hour. Then reset it again running a 9:52. This is the Eliminator owned by Don Nicholson from Atlanta, Georgia. The 1968 Mercury Cougar by Logie Stamping Company was powered by a supercharged Nitro 427 Ford SOHC with an automatic transmission. In 1968 in Detroit, Michigan, it ran a 735. Here is the Kenz and Leslie 777 owned by Bill Kenz and Roy Leslie from Denver, Colorado. The 1966 Mercury Comet by Logie Stamping Company was powered by an injected Nitro 427 Ford SOHC with an automatic transmission. On September 25, 1966 in Tulsa, Oklahoma, it ran a 904 at 168 miles per hour. I read the car became airborne at Tulsa and flipped over backward. They ran this car with a new body in 1967. This is the STP Cougar Country owned by Maynard Rupp from Harper Woods, Michigan. The 1967 Mercury Cougar by Logie Stamping Company was powered by an injected Nitro 427 Ford SOHC with an automatic transmission. In 1967 at Cecil County, it ran a 826. I read the STP Cougar was a Carcraft cover car. It was sold and became Jerry Schwartz's Ratty Cat. Here is probably the most famous car to ever run a Ford 427 Cammer engine, the Malco Automotive Chemicals car owned by George Montgomery from Dayton, Ohio. The 1933 Willies coupe by George Montgomery ran a 4-speed manual transmission. The car weighed 2,400 pounds. On August 21, 1966 in Columbus, Ohio, it ran a 971 at 149 miles per hour. If someone was to ask me to put a price on this car, I wouldn't even know where to begin. If you are thinking about building or buying a Ford Cammer engine for your car, be prepared. Whether you go original or aftermarket, nothing is cheap. The following pictures are from an online auction site. In 2021 they had a rebuilt Ford Cammer engine listed. There were 35 bids, and on October 21, 2021 it sold for $60,000. Here is another 427 Cammer engine listing from an online auction site. This was a rare never-used zero-hour crate engine that was originally delivered to Holman Moody in 1966. The engine received 45 bids, and on February 17, 2023 it sold for $140,000. If you want a new Cammer, you can buy that too. There are several builders that offer Ford Cammer engines today. They are built with all aftermarket parts and cost up to $65,000. So if you want one, you better bring your wallet. This Ford engine was built to compete in NASCAR. It was never intended to be on the drag strip. The single carburetor version in 1964 made 616 horsepower, but Ford decided not to continue with the engine. So I'll close with this. Just think if Ford would have offered this engine to the general public in a production car and what the evolution of this engine may have brought. It makes you think about what might have been. Unfortunately, once the original run of Ford Camry engines and parts ran out, it was over. Please comment below. As always, thanks for watching.